do not know that the earliest believers did not have a book called the New Testament. They had the oracles or the writings now called the Old Testament. In New Testament times, there was no New Testament. So how did the Gospels and individual letters come to be viewed as Holy Scripture alongside the older writings of the ancient Israelites? Let's begin with the unspoken reason for why they wanted to burn, hide, and edit the scrolls. If you remember this passage from 1 Maccabees 3, the enemy came in and laid waste to the city of Jerusalem. Later, when the Israelites had assembled themselves, they prayed and they fasted. And verse 48 says they laid open the book of the law, wherein the heathen had sought to paint the likeness of their images. Now let's really understand what this word image really means, because normally we only associate it with a picture. You have heard the saying that a picture is worth 1,000 words, because it's often easier to express something in a picture than it is to describe it with word. It has been proven that images can impact the brain in a way that will influence the emotions, memory, and decision making. Just look at this picture. When you look at this image, it can evoke very strong reactions almost instantaneously. And this happens because the brain can process visual information much faster than words. So the Europeans plastered this image everywhere. They told us this is Jesus. This is your Lord and Savior. And they equated this image with the one who was sent to save us. This image was in every church. It's in the Bibles. It's everywhere. So when people see it, a message is communicated automatically. Everything that they have been taught and the emotions and experiences they've had are attached to this image. But look at the deception. Christians gave our people this image and said he is the one we should turn to for salvation, while they kept our ancestors enslaved and treated them like animals. So whose Savior was he? Now we know that our Messiah looked nothing like this, and he came to save the lost sheep of the house of Israel. But here's the thing. Just because Europeans hijacked Yeshua's message and presented him with blonde hair and blue eyes does not mean he didn't exist. Case in point, the Europeans also changed the image of the Israelites. They presented them as people who look like this one in the image, and the world believes that those people are the chosen people. Now you tell me, does it mean that the true people with woolly hair and dark melanated skin didn't exist? So as defined by Cambridge Dictionary, an image is more than a picture. It is a message. Listen, this says an image is a picture in your mind or an idea of how someone or something is. It represents the way that thing or that person is thought of by other people. Look at these images here. When you see these images, words are not needed. For our people, these are triggers. It brings back everything slavery represented. This is a message. The narrative that your kind is not human comes to mind when you look at a lot of these. So these images represent the way our people were thought of by others. An image is also a mental picture or idea that forms a reader's or listener's mind from the words that they read or hear. Let's look at an example of that. So just look at these words here. Would you agree that certain words were weaponized in order to create a mental picture or an idea in the mind of the reader or listener? Which group of people do you think of when you hear these words? Our men were called boy. Come here, boy. Our people were referred to as being lazy. The women, welfare queens. And now it's not fashionable to say Nigger, it's the N word. Who do you think of when you hear them talk about thugs or baby mama? So your image can also be your reputation. Have you ever heard people complain about their image being tarnished? Well, they're talking about their reputation. How are they portrayed or seen matters. Now let's take it a step further. What do you think of when you hear the curse of Ham? Well, you think, okay, they're talking about us because they say the black skin caused us to be cursed. Do you see how this works? This strategy is still working centuries later. The enemy had to change how we see ourselves. So before you can create a new image, you have to tear down the old one first. And for some people, it takes time because they have to dismantle, they have to deconstruct the lies and then detach from the strong emotions, the memories, and the associations. So we're going to read some excerpts from this Forward magazine article called Blacks and Jews United as Subjects of Hate. And of course, I will be replacing the word with Yehudim or Israelite. Listen, it says the cultural historians Sander Gilman and Abraham Melamed noted that for centuries, Israelites were described as black. For centuries, it said. But at the same time, some anti-Semites worried that Jewish people were indistinguishable from Christians. And it's appropriate to say the ish people here because the switcheroo was taking place during that time. They were presenting themselves as us. So those who were saying they were Israelites were made to wear special distinguishing hats and badges in medieval Europe. Well, when were the medieval times? 500 AD to 1500 AD. What was going on with our people during that time? So they're asking the question, did Israelites look like blacks or white Christians to these people? Do you know why they were confused? Because they were saying that the Israelites were indistinguishable from Christians because during that era, Christian meant white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, namely people of European descent. And when they saw that the people who say they are us, a lot of them had European features, they didn't know how to distinguish between the two. Because centuries before, the people had been described as dark melanated people. It goes on to say, it's true that both of those things occurred in tandem. It was all happening at the same time during this era. It says clearly, Israelites were represented as black in some medieval Christian iconography and in recorded conversations where Yehudim are referred to as ugly as blacks. It says probably the color of Yehudim hasn't changed in reality over the past 1,000 years. Did you hear that? The color hasn't changed. over the past 1,000 years. So what happened? The image changed. The image changed. Listen to what it says next. So it says, so it's a curious double fate. Yet this double think has been consistent over that time. Now listen to this. Don't miss it. The Nazis were alarmed because they couldn't tell the difference between Jews and non-Jews. And I'm using that deliberately here. They couldn't tell the difference. Why couldn't they tell the difference? Because our people were supposed to be picking cotton. Our people were supposed to be the ones they were discriminating against. They were not supposed to look like Europeans. So the people were confused. So it says, the Nazis tried to find ways to tell the difference between the two, but at the same time, they were convinced that Israelites were black. I hope you're understanding what this is saying. The political and religious leaders had to present a new image to the world before the New Testament could be distributed as their book. And because we were primarily a people with an oral history and we had very little iconography, it was easy for Europeans to create their own image of what the Israelites looked like and present them to the world as people of the book. Now, some of you may remember that some time ago I shared some pictures that were found in Dura-Europos. It's the synagogue in Syria. And for those who may not know about that synagogue, it was discovered in Syria in 1932. It was dated from an Aramaic inscription to 244 AD. Let's make sure we understand that these paintings reflect what the people looked like in the 1st and 2nd century, which would have been closer to the time of the destruction of Jerusalem. So I'm going to share some excerpts from this History of Information article. And it says that this synagogue is unique in that it was preserved virtually intact. It was preserved, ironically, when it had to be infilled with earth to strengthen the city's fortifications against a Sasanian assault in 256. The synagogue contains a forecourt and house of assembly with frescoed walls depicting people and animals, and a Torah shrine in the western wall facing Jerusalem. The synagogue paintings, the earliest continuous surviving biblical narrative cycle, are conserved at Damascus. They are the only set of surviving wall paintings other than floor mosaics. So it says, the painted scenes of stories include Moses receiving the law, Moses leading the Hebrews out of Egypt, and many others. It is thought that the synagogue was used in part as an instructional display to educate and teach the history and laws of the religion. Some think that this synagogue was painted in order to compete with the many other religions practiced in Dura-Europos. The large-scale pictorial art in the synagogue helps to dispel narrow interpretations of historically prohibited visual images. Why were the images prohibited, family? Why were they trying to hide it? Just think about that for a second. So when the synagogue was found virtually intact, the images that were painted on the walls depict Israelites as dark brown people with woolly hair. As I said earlier, a picture is worth 1,000 words. But the elite, those who control the narrative, they're fighting to maintain the status quo because they have to protect their lies at all costs. So I'm going to show just a quick slideshow of some of the images they found in this synagogue. Now I want to highlight just a few of those images, and this is the one of Moses in the burning bush. And it's said that the image not only shows Moses, but it's showing the presence of Yah as indicated by the fire in the bush, and also by the gesturing of the hand in the upper left corner. So the hand is dark brown as well, family. It says the divine hand is a key element in the synagogue iconography, appearing also in the frescoes depicting the sacrifice of Isaac, the crossing of the Red Sea, Elijah reviving the widow's son, and Ezekiel's vision of the restoration of the nation. Here's the thing. People living during that era felt a need to paint the pictures. And it may be because they could see how the Greeks and Romans were trying to whitewash everything. But the fact that these murals were found virtually intact is proof that Europeans knew then what the ancient Israelites looked like. They had to have known because our people were still living in Jerusalem, still living in Judea. And as it said in Maccabees, they needed to insert their own images so that they could rewrite history. Take a look at this image. This one isn't from Dura-Europos. This is another one. This one was actually found in the State Russian Museum in St. Petersburg, and it's dated 1410 CE. So, family, clearly Europeans had iconography even back then, revealing what the people look like. And that's why writers from that era were describing them as black. So how interesting is it that the picture is depicting a dark, melanated man as an apostle? Well, surely this is not aligned with the whitewashed version of Christian iconography. So yes, there was a need to whitewash everything. And for those who keep coming here to say that color doesn't matter, let's go ahead and admit that you're not a lover of truth. You're actually hypocritical. The one you claim to serve is a lover of truth. So let's go on. Here's another mural that was found, and this one is of Messiah healing the paralytic man and one of him walking on water. This was in that Dura-Europos synagogue. So remember, this place was in Syria, or it's in Syria, not Europe. and it was hidden away from the world until 1932. So if you can accept the depictions of Moses, Isaac, and Ezekiel, why disregard the images of Messiah and say everything in the New Testament is a lie? Why would they just create these images of him healing a man and walking on water? Where'd that come from? This is a close-up of that same image we were talking about of him healing the paralytic man. Clearly you see burnt bronze skin color, just like it is described in the book of Revelation 1:15. So the images from Dura-Europos is evidence that our people were there. Do we have scriptural evidence for that? Yes, we do. Is it safe to say that the Israelites who went there took scrolls with them? My question would be, why wouldn't they? And we also know that our scrolls passed through several hands before the Roman Catholic Church got a hold of it. They needed to insert themselves in the book, and that's why they had to present a new image before working on the New Testament. And now we're going to find out why they needed the New Testament. According to this article from Western Civilization, it's talking about how the Roman Empire was on the verge of collapse before they found the thing that brought about a resurgence. So they hijacked the gospel, and it allowed them to redefine themselves under the banner of the religion known as Christianity. Listen, it says, Rome underwent half a century of crisis in the middle of the 3rd century CE. Beset along its borders and hobbled by constant infighting, the empire was at real risk of collapse for decades. Listen, it did not collapse, however, and in fact enjoyed a resurgence of a sort that held the Roman state together until the end of the 5th century. So what you need to understand is that Rome lives on in the Roman Catholic Church. Rome is the last empire from Daniel's prophecy. Europeans want us to believe that Rome is no more, but why do you think they call it the Roman Catholic Church? The Romans recreated themselves, and they live on in the religion. Let's go on. It says, in fact, the period between the end of the 5 good emperors and the collapse of Rome was much more complex than one of simple decline and weakness. And even when the city of Rome could not defend itself, Roman civilization left an enormous permanent impression on Western civilization. Perhaps most importantly, what began as an obscure cult in Roman-ruled Judea eventually became one of the great world religions, Christianity, thanks to its success in spreading throughout the Roman Empire before the Western empires collapse. But they had to destroy the true image and recreate a new one first. And let's remember that this last empire described in the book of Daniel would destroy the temple and the city. That happened in 70 AD. But just so you know, the Yehudims didn't go down without a fight. Let's read this. It says, the Roman territory of Palestine was a thorn in Rome's side, thanks to the unshakable opposition of the Yehudim. Palestine suffered from heavy taxation and deeply felt resentment toward the Romans. One key point of contention was that the Yehudim refused to pay lip service to the divinity of the emperors. The Romans insisted that their subjects participate in symbolic rituals acknowledging the primacy of the emperors. But since the Israelites were strict monotheists, they would not do so. So in 66 CE, there was a huge uprising against Rome. It took 4 years for imperial forces to crush the uprising, resulting in the greatest disaster in ancient Israelite history, the permanent destruction of the Temple of Jerusalem in 70 CE. In the aftermath, the Romans enslaved or deported much of the Israelite population, which contributed to the phenomenon of the Israelite diaspora. That's us today, the people without a homeland, united only by the Hebrew Bible, the teaching of the rabbis, and their cultural traditions. So, family, yes, our people put up a fight before Rome brought an end to their rebellion. But listen to what it's telling you here. They enslaved a lot of the people, or they deported them. And we've already covered the fact that those people ran into various countries. When they got into those countries, they're now represented as a minority. Let's keep going. We know that it fulfilled Bible prophecy when they were scattered across the world and trafficked in the slave trades. So it goes on to talk about how the Romans also put Messiah to death, and the major source of information about his life and teachings are in the 4 Gospels. It says the Gospels were transmitted orally for decades before recording or being recorded in their definitive versions. Most scholars now date the written Gospels to approximately 90 CE, so about 60 years after the death of Messiah. It says, while the specific language of the Gospels is, of course, different, and some of the events described are also described differently, the Gospels agree on most of the major aspects of the life of Messiah. As it goes on, it talks about how Messiah's apostles began to teach others his lessons. And the author says, as a result of this, the new religion of Christianity was born. However, let's make sure we understand that these were Israelites following the teachings of Messiah. Gentiles turned it into a religion for their own benefit. Let's go on. It says, before Constantine's conversion, Christianity expanded through missionary work, which succeeded in founding congregations across the empire, but did not seriously disrupt polytheism or the empire's religious diversity. Imperial sponsorship changed that because it linked secular power to Christian identity. Following Constantine's conversion, being a Christian, listen, became a way to get ahead in the Roman power structure. And over time, it became a liability to remain a polytheist. So there were benefits in converting to this religion that was created by the Gentiles. Again, it was created by them for their benefit. So it says, thus, whereas early Christianity had been a religion of the common people, Roman elites flocked to convert after Constantine did so in order to stay in the emperor's good graces. It goes on to say, almost immediately after Constantine became a Christian, bishops saw their secular power increase dramatically. He allowed bishops to serve as official judges, giving Christians the ability to request a bishop instead of a non-Christian judge in trial. Bishops also moved in administrative circles, representing not just the church, but their cities in actions and requests before governors and assemblies. In short, bishops suddenly assumed power on par with that of the traditional Roman nobility, directly linking power within the Christian church hierarchy to power within the Roman political system. I hope you all are seeing that this had nothing to do with being transformed or living a godly life. This had nothing to do with Messiah's teachings. This was a way to get ahead, to move up, to acquire wealth. Let's go on. Now listen to what it says here. It says the Pope's role as leader of the church emerged for a few reasons. First and foremost, the symbolic power of the city of Rome itself gave added weight to the Roman archbishop's authority. Second, there was a doctrinal tie to the Apostle Peter. What was the doctrinal tie to the Apostle Peter? Well, they said Peter was the first pope, and that Peter gave the Roman Catholic Church the authority to rule and the keys to the kingdom. Now let's remember that the Romans persecuted and ended the life of most of the apostles and the early believers. But they're saying Peter gave them the authority. Well, it's true because they said so. So supposedly, Peter gave them the symbolic keys to heaven, and supposedly those keys came directly from Christ, which were in turn passed on to his successor in Rome, the Archbishop of Rome, before being crucified. What utter nonsense. It says Roman archbishops could thus argue that the Christian church itself was centered in Rome and that they inherited the spiritual keys to heaven upon taking office. This concept was known as the Petrine succession. By the mid-5th century CE, the popes were claiming to have total authority over all other bishops, and at least some of those bishops in Western Europe did look to Rome for guidance. In later centuries, the mere fact that the early popes had claimed that authority and certain bishops had acknowledged it was cited as proof that the Roman papacy had always been, listen, the supreme doctrinal power in the church as a whole. Listen carefully, because this information here is going to tell us why we now have to examine the doctrines that were taught. This is the leaven. It says all across the empire, massive church buildings were erected by emperors. Right from the beginning of official Christianity, Constantine financed construction of huge churches, including the Basilica of St. Peter in what is today the Vatican. At the time, it was an obscure graveyard in Rome. It says the traditional Roman public buildings, including forums, theaters, bathhouses, and so on, were often neglected in favor of churches, and many temples to Roman gods and other public buildings were repurposed as churches. I hope you caught that. Many temples to Roman gods and other public buildings were repurposed as churches. It says once it enjoyed the support of the Roman elite. This is key. The Christian church began incorporating non-Christian holidays into its own liturgical calendar. December 25th had been the major festival of the sun god Sol Invictus, and early Christians embraced the overlap between that celebration and Christmas, noting that Christ was like the sun as a source of spiritual life. Do you see how they just slipped that one right in there? It says other Christian holidays like Easter coincided with various fertility festivals that took place in early spring, around the time of the spring equinox. It goes on to say the tradition of saints' days, holidays celebrated in veneration of specific saints, often overlapped with various non-Christian celebrations. So most church leaders saw no theological problem with this practice. Family, most church leaders saw no theological problem with this practice. Why? That's why didn't they see a problem with this? So they argued that the ultimate goal was the salvation of souls through conversion, so it made perfect sense to use existing holy days and rituals in order to ease the transition for new converts. But yet those celebrations remain in place today. So why did they feel a need to come up with this book called the New Testament? It says in 325 CE, only a little over a decade after he had converted to Christianity, Constantine assembled a council of church leaders, the Council of Nicaea, to lay Arianism to rest. So one of the results that came out of that council was the Nicene Creed, and it's often referred to as the Apostles' Creed. To this day, it's one of the central elements of Catholic math. What it did was to create a set of beliefs regarding the divinity of Messiah, his resurrection, and the promise of his return at the end of the world, and some additional things. Now, those beliefs were backed by the Roman Catholic Church. The problem was that some of the Christians spoke Latin and others spoke Greek. So a monk named Jerome produced a version of the Christian Bible called the Vulgate. It was supposed to be the main edition in Europe until the 16th century. But it wasn't until 1442, during the Renaissance, that the final version of the Bible was established by the Western Church, I should say, after it defined exactly which books of the Old Testament were to be included and which were not. So who decided which books would be in the Bible? The Roman Catholic Church. Let's be clear about that. But the real motivation is it allowed them to incorporate their set of beliefs that was now backed by institutional authority. So in essence, they made it their book. And I know it's hard for some to hear, but it's true. The Romans, the same people who put Messiah to death, and many of his apostles, by the way, took over his message because they saw how it was influencing people. These are the same people who sacked Jerusalem and put our ancestors in captivity. Just pause and think on that. They gave themselves the right to pick and choose which Old Testament manuscripts they were going to keep and which ones they would get rid of. They then pieced together the manuscripts from letters written after the death of Messiah, and they put all of those writings together and called it the Holy Bible. Listen, it says, more important than their economic productivity, at least from the perspective of the history of ideas, is that monasteries became the major centers of learning, especially in Western Europe, after the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. One of the tasks undertaken by monks was the painstaking hand copying of books, almost all of which had to do with Christian theology, the Bible itself, commentaries from important Christian leaders, etc., but some of which were classical Greek or Roman writings that would have otherwise been lost. Often these books were beautifully illustrated by the monks and are referred to as illuminated manuscripts, among the finest examples of medieval art. So family, these monks became the new scribes. Isn't this sounding like the practices of the Pharisees? And for those who would say, well, see, that's why you shouldn't read the New Testament, let's make sure we understand that they had their hands on the Old Testament as well. They decided which Old Testament books were canon. Our ancestors had other books. It goes on to say, outside of monasteries, churches were built in practically every city and town and many small villages in the Roman sphere of influence. And it goes on to talk about how popular relics became. It says relics were everything from the bones of saints to fragments of the true cross. Each church had to have a relic in its altar, or it was not considered to be truly holy ground. And it says all relics were not created equal. The larger the object, or the closer it had been to Messiah or the apostles, the more holy power it was believed to contain. Thus, a thriving trade in relics began in Europe. So churches were competing against each other. They were trying to secure the most powerful relic for their church. It says this was not just about the symbolic importance of the relics, as pilgrims would travel from all over the Roman world to visit the site of noteworthy relics. Family, do you see what this is here? The root of this was greed and power. Let's go on. And now it's time to talk about the forming of the New Testament, because it really is a surprise to Christians that the followers of Messiah had no writings of their own during his day. The stories about him circulated orally. So let's take a look at this article from Theology Matters. It says, the formation of the New Testament canon. It says the term canon, used with reference to the Bible, means the collection of books which are received as divinely inspired and therefore authoritative for faith and life. The recognition of the canon of the New Testament is one of the most important developments in the thought and practice of the early church. Yet history is silent as to how, when, and by whom it was brought about. It says it is possible, however, to reconstruct some of the influences that must have contributed to the emergence of the New Testament canon. All right, let's keep going. It says, as far as can be determined, the chief criterion for acceptance of particular writings as sacred, authoritative, and worthy of being read in services of worship was apostolic authorship. This requirement, however, was not applied in a narrow sense, for in the case of two of the Gospels, the tradition of apostolic atmosphere and association, Mark with Peter and Luke with Paul, vouched for their authority. Other tests of canonicity included the question of a book's general harmony with the rest of the New Testament and its continuous acceptance and usage in the churches as a sign of its value. So here are some questions we need to dig into. Who had apostolic authorship? We need to know who had apostolic authority. What's the difference between the two? What else do we want to know? Why did the writings of Paul stand out more prominently than the other apostles? We're going to talk about these things during the live this coming Wednesday, so be sure to join me for that. Yes, it's time to talk about Paul. I want to wrap up with these words from Psalm 105, 6 through 10, because these are words we need to remember and get it down in our heart. In spite of it all, we were given a future and a hope. They can try to pretend to be us all they want. We were given a future and a hope. The enemy tried to wipe us out, family. If they could have, they would have. But here we are. Listen to these words. O ye seed of Abraham, his servant, listen, ye children of Jacob his chosen. He is the Most High Yah, his judgments are in all the earth. He has remembered his covenant forever, the word which he commanded to 1,000 generations, which covenant he made with Abraham and his oath unto Isaac, and confirmed the same unto Jacob for a law, and to Israel for an everlasting covenant. Now, scripture says it's impossible for Yah to lie. So do not fret, family. You were given a covenant. You have a promise. You have an oath. So the best is yet to come for you, Israel. The best is yet to come. If this message has been a blessing to you, please hit the like and share it. You're also welcome to subscribe if you have not already done so. We normally upload messages on Sunday mornings at 8:30 a.m. Join me next time.